In this three-part session, we'll be looking at some of the background issues related to the way that the history of biblical Israel has been studied over the last few centuries. In this first part, we'll consider some of the philosophical and intellectual challenges connected to the writing of Israel's history. In the second and third parts, we'll look at the way that the chronology for the ancient world and biblical Israel have been constructed, and then wrap up with a quick overview of the major archaeological periods that comprise the era in which biblical Israel lived. We begin our look at the history of Israel by asking what appears to be an obvious question. What is history? Now, you may think that it is not necessary to ask that question. After all, everyone knows what history is. However, because some people have claimed that the Bible cannot be taken seriously as history because A, it doesn't tell the complete story, its presentation is selective, and B, it recounts the story from a particular perspective. So, given those accusations and the inclination to discount the Bible as history because of them, we need to ask the question, what is history? The answer to the question is relatively straightforward, because if by history you mean a complete and unbiased recording or account of what has happened, then there really is no such thing as history. You see, all recounting of the past is incomplete and therefore selective. If it's selective, then the decision about which events to include and how to arrange those events reflect the editorial perspective of the author. Because all recounting of the past is selective, and all recounting of the past is done by individuals who speak from a certain perspective, then all history writing, not just the history of the Bible, but all history writing, is both selective and perspectival. So if selection disallows the Bible from being history, then it would disallow all history writing. If perspective disallows the Bible as history, then it would also disallow any history writing, because the existence of editorial perspective does not, in and of itself, render history false. So we don't disallow all history writing on that basis, and we can't reasonably disallow the history of the Bible on that basis either. Because these facts of selectivity and arrangement and perspective are as true of the historical portions of the Bible as they are of any other type of history writing. Now, we might also ask a further question, namely, what kind of history do we have in the Bible? That is to say, if the biblical authors are writing for a particular reason, what is the reason for which they're writing? They're not writing simply to record the past. Rather, the Bible contains what we might regard as theological history. It's the history of God's dealing with his people and with his creation. And so, yes, it's selective. Yes, it's perspectival. Yes, it's a particular kind of history, but none of that disqualifies a priori the Bible from being taken seriously as history. Any discussion of the history of Israel must take into account the sources that will be used to frame that understanding. So when it comes to the Bible and the history of Israel, we typically speak of two kinds of sources. The first of these kinds of sources is what we might describe as internal evidence. By internal evidence, we mean really evidence that's found in the Bible, internal to the Bible. In addition to internal sources, we also have what we would describe as external sources. Now, there are a variety of these, but they generally fall together under the general heading of archaeology. And when most people think of archaeology, they think in terms of structures or buildings that have been uncovered, such as the one you see in the picture here. But these kinds of buildings and other things that archaeologists would call material remains are only one category of evidence that's produced by archaeology. Another kind of archaeological evidence arises from the technological analysis of archaeological finds. For example, here we're looking at a carbon-14 dating report for some biological material found at a particular site. We'll talk about this report more a little later. But the use of technology and the employment of technology in the analysis of the finds of archaeology is another important source of information. A third source of external information related to archaeology are what we would call epigraphical finds, that is to say, writings. In this case, we're looking at the law code of Hammurabi. This and other writings also have an impact on our understanding of the history of Israel in the Old Testament period. So we have internal evidence and external evidence, and the external evidence is primarily related to things that most people would think of as archaeology. But here's the thing when it comes to archaeology that we have to remember. Archaeology never proves anything. That is to say, archaeology does not prove the Bible, nor does it disprove the Bible. What archaeology does is provide data, and that data has to be interpreted and understood within some kind of interpretive framework. So most of the time, when it comes to the debates over archaeology and its impact on our understanding of Israel's history, the real issue is not the data, but the interpretive framework within which that data is understood. And the reason for that is that the presuppositions of the interpreter will shape what data they look at and how that evidence is interpreted, and as a result, it will shape how one views the relationship between internal evidence from the Bible itself and external evidence from a wide variety of sources that we typically associate with archaeology. The question of the relationship between the internal evidence of the Bible itself and the external evidence that comes to us from archaeology is the fundamental issue behind the problem of how we understand Israel's history. This is a debate that's gone on within academic circles for several centuries now. If we look at the book A Biblical History of Israel by Provin Long and Longman, the first part of their book, the first 4 chapters, deals with the problems associated with writing the history of Israel, the historiography of Israel and the Bible. Now, this is a tremendously in-depth and very helpful study, but probably a little more than we need for our purposes at the moment. So let me just say this. The bottom line that you should understand is that over the course of the last several centuries, virtually every aspect of the Bible's account of Israel's history has been called into question. And there are several reasons for this, But at the heart of all of them is what we might think of as the modernist perspective on how the world operates. So there are three elements that make up this modernist perspective that shape the way that people have interpreted Israel's history. The first of these elements is a focus on intermediate causes. Now, by intermediate causes, we mean things like physical causes or economic causes or political causes or sociological causes or psychological causes. In the modern world, people look to intermediate causes for an explanation of why something happened. Whereas in the Bible, or perhaps we should say, the Bible concerns itself with what we might regard as the ultimate cause. So to use an example, consider the collapse of the walls of Jericho. The Bible clearly suggests that God is responsible for the collapse of the walls of Jericho. He commands Joshua and the Israelites to march around the walls and to blow the horns, and when they do that, the walls fall down. God caused them to fall. Now, a modern archaeologist looking at the site of Jericho might well conclude that because Jericho is sitting almost squarely on top of a major earthquake fault, that an earthquake caused the walls of Jericho to fall. An earthquake would be an example of an intermediate cause, in this case a physical cause. The question is whether the suggestion of an earthquake contradicts the Bible's account of God's responsibility for the collapse of the walls of Jericho, or whether it fits within the Bible's account. Now, there are those who try to find intermediate explanations for every apparently miraculous event in the Bible. I have on my shelf in my office a book that deals with the miracles of the book of Exodus. And there the author suggests that the burning bush was caused by a gas leak that was behind the bush from where Moses was standing. And the gas leak was ignited and the flames popped up and burned, but they weren't really engulfing the bush, they were behind the bush. And so the bush appeared to be burning, but was not consumed. Now, if we try to assess that claim in light of the Bible's narrative, clearly that claim undermines the Bible's narrative about God's appearance to Moses on Mount Sinai, in a way that the suggestion that an earthquake caused the walls of Jericho to collapse does not. Because you can read the account in the book of Joshua of the collapse of the walls of Jericho, and nothing that's said there precludes the possibility of an earthquake or requires it either one, for that matter. But if you read the account of the burning bush in Exodus 3, clearly there is a miraculous element that the text requires and a naturalistic explanation of the bush being only appearing to be burned because of a gas leak, a natural gas leak behind it, would undermine the miraculous nature of the event that the Bible recounts. So in one case, in the case of the burning bush, the intermediate cause has to be rejected by anyone who takes the Bible's account seriously. Whereas in the case of the collapse of the walls of Jericho, the intermediate explanation, the naturalistic cause, could fit well within the Bible's narrative without contradicting anything in that narrative. So one of the things that happens for modernist interpreters is that all things that are described as miraculous within the Bible come to be attributed to intermediate or naturalistic causes. This is one of the factors that shapes the way the history of Israel is interpreted by modern readers. A second element coming into play is what we might describe as a positivist epistemology. Now, epistemology is a philosophical term that refers to how one knows what one knows. In other words, what is the basis of our knowing? And in the modern world, it is widely accepted that only those things that come to us by way of the senses, that are perceivable by the senses, can be regarded as true and actual knowledge. So things that we see, things that we hear, things that we can touch, those we accept as real. But things that cannot be seen or touched are generally rejected as unreal. This is what is meant when we refer to a positivist epistemology, a theory of knowledge that depends on those things that can be positively known through the senses or through the senses as they're aided by instruments that we have created. The third element to the modernist view of history is, broadly speaking, the triumph of human reason. The modern world holds that conformity to human reason is the only acceptable basis of faith. By contrast, it is virtually the essence of biblical faith that it transcends human reason. It cannot, faith grasps and clings to those things that cannot be seen or cannot be understood on the basis of reason alone. So these three elements, a focus on intermediate causes, a positivist epistemology, and the triumph of human reason, explain how the modern world has come to understand the history of Israel in relation to the Bible and why the Bible is typically rejected by most modernists as a source for Israel's history. We see these three principles coming home to roost in a German philosopher and theologian by the name of Ernst Troeltsch. Troeltsch lived at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and in 1898 he wrote a book entitled On Historical and Dogmatic Method in Theology. And in this book, Troeltsch identifies three principles that he says undergird the modern historical method when it comes to theology. The first of these three principles is what Troeltsch called the principle of criticism. Now, basically, Troeltsch's principle of criticism is the assertion of methodological doubt. Now, Troeltsch was not the first person to identify the importance of doubt in the process of discovery and knowing. Already in the late 11th, early 12th century, the French theologian Peter Abelard emphasized the importance of doubt. And after him, by a few centuries, the French philosopher René Descartes made doubt the starting point for intellectual inquiry. And that's really where people like Abelard and Descartes differ from what Troeltsch has in mind. For Troeltsch, doubt was not the starting point to lead to certainty. Rather, Troeltsch argues that historical study produces only probability, not certainty. And so one is always left with doubt, with a certain degree of doubt about the past. So Abelard and Descartes would have argued that you have to begin with doubt to arrive at certainty. But for Troeltsch, you begin with doubt and you end with uncertainty, with doubt as well. The second principle that Troeltsch identified was the principle of analogy. By the principle of analogy, Troeltsch meant that present observable events have to shape our understanding of non-observable events in the past. In other words, there's an analogy between the way things happen today and the way that they happened in the ancient world. So the bottom line from Troeltsch's principle of analogy is that things happened in the past in the same way that they happen today. So if we don't see God at work, performing miraculous events like dividing the Red Sea, we can't assume that God was at work doing those in the past. So miraculous events in the Bible, like healing, have to be explained not as miraculous intervention on the part of God, but rather the result of some natural process, the way that we see it happening in the world today. The third principle that Troeltsch identifies is today typically called the principle of correlation. And this is perhaps the most difficult to understand, at least in terms of its terminology, the meaning of the word correlation. By the principle of correlation, Troeltsch understands history to be an interconnected sequence of events, so that everything that happens in history and in the world has to be explained in terms of the kinds of causes and events that we see driving change in the world today. The net result of this principle of correlation is that it eliminates miracles and other kinds of direct intervention on the part of God in human history, because God, by definition, is outside of the normal sequence of cause and effect. And so therefore, he cannot be called upon as an explanation for why these events happened. So these three principles identified by Troeltsch, the principle of criticism, the principle of analogy, and the principle of correlation, form the basis of Troeltsch's understanding of the way modern thinkers approach the Bible and theology. And by the way, Troeltsch did not invent these three, did not claim to invent these three. He observed that this is what people were doing around him. And so he gave names to them, but he didn't invent them per se. Well, Troeltsch is an example of the way that modern interpreters approach the history of the Bible. This has led to an outlook that we typically call historical minimalism. I mentioned earlier that over the last several centuries, virtually every aspect of the Bible's account of Israel's history has been called into question. So let me give you a concrete example of this at work by looking at the history of Israel's monarchy. For those who read the biblical record, the history of Israel's monarchy looks something like this. It begins somewhere around the middle of the 11th century with the changes that lead to the rise of Saul as Israel's first king. Saul gives way to David, who becomes king after him, and during the reigns of David and Solomon, there was a united monarchy that ruled over both the north and the south of Israel. After the death of Solomon, in 930, this united monarchy collapsed, and there emerged from it two distinctive kingdoms. A northern kingdom with a series of dynastic rulers over the course of several centuries from about 930 to 721, and the southern kingdom, which we call Judah, which continued the dynasty begun by David until its eventual conquest by the Babylonians and having been taken into exile in 587. Now, compare this with someone who accepts a very hardline historical minimalist view of history. One scholar that I know well has argued that the history of Israel's monarchy looks like this. That is to say that the northern kingdom formulated a state, came together and coalesced as a nation state about the time that the Bible says the division of the kingdoms happened, 930, perhaps a little bit later than that. And this kingdom continued centered on the city of Samaria until it was conquered by the Assyrians in 722. Now, in the south, there was no monarchy in the 10th and 9th centuries, but at some point in the 8th century, the southern part of Israel began to coalesce into a political state with its own king, which comes to be called Judah. And so Judah as a kingdom didn't exist in the time of David and Solomon, because this particular scholar doesn't believe that David and Solomon were real people at all. He thinks they were invented at a later time to justify the kingdom in Judah and to paint a glorious picture of its past. A more moderate view would be something like this. Another Israeli archaeologist with whom I'm familiar has argued that there may have been a Saul who was ruler in Israel before the beginning of the 10th century. But once we get to the time of David, at least, there is a kingdom in the south and a kingdom in the north, and those two different kingdoms were never united into one monarchy. They always remain two distinctive kingdoms. So why do they arrive at these conclusions? Well, someone who's approaching this from the perspective of the biblical narrative will obviously follow the Bible's understanding of the history of Israel's monarchy, and so will accept the historicity of Saul, of David, and of Solomon, the division of the kingdom, and the maintenance of a royal household in Judah from the time of David already. The strict historical minimalist looks at the problem differently. He dismisses the Bible's evidence almost entirely and says, what can we know about the history of Israel solely on the basis of archaeology and its results? And that's why the scholar that I was speaking of has concluded that there is no united monarchy, that there was no monarchy in Judah until a much later time, because he doesn't see any archaeological evidence for it. Now, as we'll see in a moment, that may be a little bit disingenuous, but that at least is his argument. The more moderate view that allows the possibility of the existence of a Saul would say, we can't be certain about Saul because the archaeological evidence for a kingdom, a united kingdom in Judah at the time of Saul is not really there. There may be a few things that might indicate it, but really not solidly developed. However, in this case, the scholar in question does see some archaeological evidence for a centralized government having developed in the south of Israel at a much earlier period. So between the strict modernist and the moderate modernist, there are differences in both how they understand the Bible as a witness to Israel's history, but also there are differences in just how they interpret the archaeological evidence. And that's why we said archaeology never really proves anything. It provides data that has to be fit within an interpretive framework. So the person who reads and believes the Bible has an interpretive framework which gives strong credibility to the biblical account. The strict historical minimalist rejects the Bible's account almost entirely, except where it can be substantiated from the archaeological record. And even those questions or even those places might be considered suspect as having been created later because of the Bible's witness. Now, the more moderate view allows that the Bible may be a source of Israel's history on the assumption that there are texts that provide reliable historical information and therefore can be accepted even when the archaeological evidence is scanty. To give you an example of this process at work, let's look at a piece of archaeological evidence. This is what is known as the Tel Dan Inscription. It consists of 3 broken fragments of a proclamation that the king in Damascus, in what is modern-day state of Syria, in biblical times known as Aram, what that king posted to celebrate his defeat of the kings of Israel and Judah. The tablet was written in Aramaic, most likely between 850 and 750 BC. So that would be after the time of Solomon, just right before the time of Isaiah, following the traditional dating of the biblical accounts. And the Tel Dan inscription refers to the defeat and the killing of a king of Israel, perhaps Joram, and a king of the house of David, perhaps Ahaziah. The king's names are not mentioned in the document. But what is mentioned in the document, and what makes it important for us, is the reference to the king of the house of David. This would seem to suggest that the royal dynasty in Judah was known as the house of David, which would in turn seem to support the biblical narrative account of the role of David and the establishment of his family as an ongoing dynasty. Now, here in the text that you can see are the words king of the house of David, particularly the words house of David, these 2 words that we've indicated on the screen. To most interpreters, this is obviously a reference to a royal dynasty because it occurs also in the context of a reference to the king of Israel and the king of Aram or Damascus. And so the obvious and logical way to take it would be as yet another king. There are those within the historical minimalist camp who have argued that no, this is not a reference to a royal dynasty. It's a reference to a temple, a place like Bethel, where you have the word in Hebrew, Beth, connected with the name of a god. So you have Bethel, you have Bethlehem, you have Beth Shemesh, all these places with these Beth kind of names related to a deity in the Old Testament. So some have argued that the name Beth David doesn't refer to a royal dynasty, but refers instead to a temple known as the house to the god DWD, whose name is spelled DWD in Hebrew. Now the problem is we don't know of any deity by that name in Canaan who was worshipped in that period. And so the suggestion that this refers to a temple both doesn't fit in the context of the Tel Dan inscription and requires the creation of a deity that we know nothing of in ancient Canaan, all in order to explain away the reference to the house of David that's found in the Tel Dan inscription. So that's the process by which someone's presuppositions lead them to read the archaeological evidence in a certain way and to deny what would appear to be strong evidence in support of the Bible's account of the rise of Israel's monarchy.